Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Father, thank you for being here with us today, and I ask that you pour out your Holy Spirit on this place. Lead, guide, and direct the thoughts and hearts of everyone here, and just let us all focus on you. Let none of this be about me or the band or any of that, but let everything that we do here point to you. We love you, Father, and just thank you for hearing and answering our prayer. Amen. (1814), 1829, 1836, 1843, 1844, 1847, 1861, 1863, 1874, 1890, 1891, 1901, 1914, 1915, 1935, 1943, 1972, 1975, 1982, 1988, 1994, 2000, 2001, 2002, or 2011, 2012, 2013, 2015. Every single one of those years have been years where someone has predicted the second coming of Christ. And actually, that's not all of them. I shortened down that list because there was a number of people who kind of said, he's going to come within this range. But the end is near, is what we've heard for the last 200 years. And even before that, there's been people who have predicted the end of the world. These are just actually predictions for the second coming of Christ. There is probably twice as many predictions for the end of the world as far as the years go. But just in case you want to know some of the future ones, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2024, 2025, and then jumping a little bit further forward, 2057. These are all dates that people have, like a single person or a group of people have proposed for being the year that Jesus will return. We kind of cross over and just say the year the world will end, we get even more. There's some of the notable ones past this is 2060, 2129, 2239, and I kind of like that one personally, but for what it's worth. There's 2280, and then just in case that wasn't just far enough, you go way far out and there's 11,120. As far as predicted years that the world is going to end. But we're still here. Which means that, at least for the past dates, all of these prophets or people predicting, they got it wrong. So do they have any real a track record? It's really not that great of a track record. I won't say that one of these future dates isn't the date. We have absolutely no idea. But what I find amazing when I think about the end of the world, when I think about the things that are leading up to the end of the world, I see things happening all around that signify that it is getting closer, that the end is near, even though we don't have any idea how near it is. And when we think about that, at least in my mind, I wonder, is God going to send us a prophet to announce this second coming, like he sent prophets in the old days? Is there going to be some type of a warning? Is it going to be somebody standing on the side of the street with the sign that looks kind of like this, and you kind of think that they're a lunatic and kind of keep on going and turn the other, to kind of not make eye contact? Not calling any of you out on that, but or is it going to be like, what would it take? And really, is God going to do that? Or is prophecy kind of something that we need to look back on and look at the Old and the New Testament? When I think about this, a verse comes to mind, a verse in Amos. Amos chapter 3. We're going to start in verse 3 and give a couple verses moving forward to this verse, just to give it a little bit of context. Amos 3, starting in verse 3. Can two people walk together without agreeing on the direction? Does a lion ever roar in a thicket without first finding a victim? Does a young lion growl in its den without first catching its prey? Does a bird ever get caught in a trap that has no bait? Does a trap ever spring shut when there's nothing to catch? These starting to kind of get an idea that there's kind of a little bit of cause and effect here. When the ram's horn blows a warning, shouldn't the people be alarmed? Does disaster come to a city unless the Lord has planned it? And here we come to the verse. Indeed, the sovereign Lord never does anything until he reveals his plans to his servants, the prophets. Here in Amos, we read, God has said he is not going to do anything unless he reveals his plan to a prophet. Which is an interesting thing to think about, because when we read this in context, there is nothing to indicate that this was Old Testament or even New Testament. This is just kind of a general statement, which would imply that there's still a prophet or more prophets to come. But then where have all the prophets gone? Especially when we have all of these years of horrible prophetic track record, you could call it. And that, I think, has led some people to believe that prophecy ended with John. Prophecy ended in the New Testament. But if we think about that, if we kind of take that standpoint, there's not a whole lot of support for it. The people who say, well, prophecy was an Old Testament and a New Testament thing, they really have two passages that they stand on. The first is Hebrews 1 verse 1, just how the book of Hebrews opens up. I've heard people say, long ago God spoke many times and in many ways to our ancestors through the prophets. And now, in these final days, he has spoken to us through his Son. Okay, so we've got prophet, leading up to Jesus. And then we don't need any more prophets. The other passage is one of Jesus' parables where a vineyard owner plants a vineyard, then hires some tenants to manage this vineyard, and then he goes away. And these tenants aren't the most righteous people. The parable is called the parable of the evil tenants. That kind of gives a little bit of a clue. And when harvest time comes, the owner sends servant after servant to collect his share of the harvest. He's not taking the entire thing. He's getting his share. They get some because they worked it. He gets some because he owns it. And these evil tenants, they beat up some of his servants. They threaten other of his servants. They kill some of his servants, and he's getting nowhere. And so the owner says, hey, I'm going to send my son. They'll respect my son. But when the son comes, they see, hey, this is the son. If we kill him, we're a lot younger than the owner. So when the owner dies off, it'll just de facto, we'll own the vineyard then. And they kill the son. And there was no question in anybody's mind when Jesus spoke this, both the people listening in the crowd as well as Jesus' enemies, that there was no question that Jesus was talking about himself and putting himself in the role of son, and that this was spoken against the religious leaders of that time. But really, those are the only two real solid verses that speak to potentially there being an end to prophecy. The only other one is kind of a little tack on at the end of the book of Revelation that John says, hey, if you add to this or take away from it, then bad things are going to happen. But the context of that is more a context of the book of Revelation, because if you take that to mean the entire Bible, John would be guilty of it himself, because he wrote the book of John after writing the book of Revelation. People kind of don't think about that when they take that jump. And if we really wanted to be technical, the New Testament canon wasn't even put in place until after several decades or maybe even centuries after the New Testament. So there's nothing for people to really stand on if they're going to use that verse. But if you take the idea of prophecy, this gift of prophecy, and were to ask somebody living in the first century, hey, did this end with Jesus? They would laugh at you. They would laugh at you. Paul, one of the most widely known missionaries, church planters in the first century, had several things to say about this. So I'm going to share with you 4 different passages, and I want to see if we're all smart here, and we can see how these 4 passages, where the similarity is, where there's the similarity, where they kind of cross. First off, Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 6. In his grace, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. So if God has given you the ability to prophesy, speak out with as much faith as God has given you. If your gift is serving others, serve them well. If you are a teacher, teach well. If your gift is to encourage others, be encouraging. If it is giving, give generously. If God has given you the leadership ability, take the responsibility seriously. And if you have a gift for showing kindness to others, do it gladly. This is one of the key texts talking about spiritual gifts, and chances are we relate to one or more of these categories. Next passage. Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 11. Now, these are the gifts Christ gave to the church: the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, and the pastors and teachers. Their responsibility is to equip God's people to do his work and build up the church, the body of Christ. These are gifts that Jesus is giving to his church. Next passage. 1 Corinthians 12, starting in verse 7. A spiritual gift is given to each of us so that we can help each other. To one person, the Spirit gives the ability to give wise advice. To another, the same Spirit gives a message of special knowledge. The same Spirit gives great faith to another. And to someone else, the Spirit gives the gift of healing. He gives one person the power to perform miracles and another the ability to prophesy. He gives someone else the ability to discern whether a message is from the Spirit of God or from another spirit. Still another person is given the ability to speak in unknown languages, while another is given the ability to interpret what is being said. It is the one and only Spirit who distributes all these gifts. He alone decides which gift each person should have. And then jumping down, same chapter a little bit later, we have another list. Here are some of the parts that God has appointed for the church, 1 Corinthians 12, starting back in verse 28. First are the apostles, second are prophets, third are teachers, then those who do miracles, those who have the gift of healing, those who can help others, those who have the gift of leadership, those who speak in unknown languages. Do you see where all of these, do you see a similarity between all these lists? Every single one of them has the gift of prophecy listed. Whether it's prophet or the prophecy part of it, if you were to ask Paul, who lived in the first century, growing the early church, if the gift of prophecy was finished, he would laugh at you. He would laugh at you because that was the furthest thing from his mind. He wanted people to realize, hey, there is an amazing gift that God has given. All along all these other things, we would never think that pastor or evangelist or even the ability to give encouragement or any of that stuff would be just left in the past. That doesn't make any sense. And if we're going to not put any of those things in the past. We need to focus on the fact that, hey, prophecy is significant. And when we jump back into what Amos said, God's not going to do anything unless he first reveals it to his prophets. We kind of are left with the realization that he's either not going to do anything anymore in the world, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, or we maybe should be paying attention because there might be a prophet coming. That is, if we expect him to do anything. But we've been warned so many times about false prophets. What would an actual true prophet look like? And how would we know whether or not somebody saying, hey, I'm a prophet, God said this, how would we know that they're actually worthy of being listened to? Well, the Bible actually does answer this question quite well. And as I was searching through all the different passages and things, I narrowed down a list of seven ways. And if you're curious about this list, just see me. I'll just give you a little printout of it. It'd make it a little bit easier than to just try to jot down and remember. But there are 7 ways, perhaps more, but we'll say 7 ways that we can determine a true prophet from a false one. The first way we find early on, the first 2 ways are both from the book of Deuteronomy, when God is kind of instructing the Israelites about prophets that he's going to send. The book of Deuteronomy is Moses' big challenge to the people. Moses continued, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. Hey, pay attention. You need to listen to him. For this is what you yourselves requested of the Lord your God when you were assembled at Mount Sinai. You said, don't let us hear the voice of the Lord our God anymore, or see this blazing fire, for we will die. They were a little scared when they all went out to Mount Sinai and heard God speak. They said, no. Send us a messenger. We like Moses being our middleman. He said, hey, the Lord said to me, what they have said is right. It makes sense. I'm going to send messengers instead of speaking directly, in case you're wondering where the idea of prophet came from. What they have said is right. I will raise up a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell the people everything I command him. I will personally deal with anyone who will not listen to the messages the prophet proclaims on my behalf. Strong words. But any prophet who falsely claims to speak in my name or who speaks in the name of another god must die. But you may wonder, here's the question, how will we know whether or not a prophecy is from the Lord? How will we know? A valid question. If the prophet speaks in the Lord's name, but his prediction does not happen or come true, you will know that the Lord did not give that message. That prophet has spoken without my authority and need not be feared. Which simply leads us to the first way we can tell a true prophet from a false prophet. God stands behind his prophets. And if a prediction fails, you can safely ignore the prophet. Easy. All of these people claiming the end of the world and Jesus coming back and it never happened, ignore them. They're not from God. Next, that's not the only way. That's probably one of the easiest ways. But what happens if their prediction actually happens? Does that mean that we can trust them? Not necessarily. Deuteronomy 13, suppose there are prophets among you who dream dreams about the future, and they promise you signs or miracles. And the predicted signs or miracles actually happen, they occur. If they then say, come, let us worship other gods you have not known before, do not listen to them. The Lord your God is testing you to see if you truly love him with all your heart and soul. Serve only the Lord your God and fear him alone. Obey his commands. Listen to his voice and cling to him. The false prophets or visionaries who try to lead you astray must be put to death, for they encourage rebellion against the Lord your God, who redeemed you from slavery and brought you out of the land of Egypt. Since they try to lead you astray from the way the Lord your God commanded you to live, you must put them to death. And this is more of a warning to people to not just stand up and do this. This isn't necessarily God saying, I want to kill off all of this. This is a warning to say, hey, only say something if you really know that I am the one telling you to say it. If you have any doubt, maybe not so much. Probably be safer not to say it. You must put them to death. In this way you will purge the evil from among you. This is basically God saying, hey, I'm wanting you to be clean people, to get all that evil out from among you. Which leads us to the second point. God's prophets support God. It's kind of also a little bit obvious if you think about it. God's going to support his prophets and the predictions are going to happen, but these prophets are going to support God. Because if a prophet instructs you to leave God, you probably should leave that prophet instead. Just saying. And then jumping into the New Testament, we have a number of other instructions for how to tell a true prophet and a false prophet. And if we think about this rationally, the only reason for the New Testament to say, hey, here's some things between true and false prophets would be if there's true prophets going to come. Otherwise, they just say, forget about it. 1 John 3:9, we come up with the next one. Those who have been born into God's family do not make a practice of sinning because God's life is in them. So they can't keep on sinning because they are children of God. So now we can tell who are children of God and who are children of the devil. By this, anyone who does not live righteously and does not love other believers does not belong to God. We have this idea of love, which brings us to the third point. God's prophets live for and love God. They love something else, then that doesn't really make sense that they would be from God for God. A quote-unquote prophet who does not love others is not from God. This is starting to kind of take in a little bit of the character of the person making the prediction and kind of moving away from the message. The fourth way comes to us in Matthew 7, verse 5. This is Jesus talking specifically and warning his disciples, beware of false prophets who come disguised as harmless sheep but are really vicious wolves. You can identify them by their fruit, that is, by the way they act. Can you pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? A good tree produces good fruit and a bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot produce good fruit. So every tree that does not produce good fruit is chopped down and thrown into the fire. Yes, just as you can't identify a tree by its fruit, so you can identify people by their actions. And this opens by talking specifically about a prophet, about prophets and prophecy, which means that God's prophets will model God's character. And that also means that a sinning prophet just proved that God didn't send them. Here I want to pause and point out that everyone has sinned. So a perfect prophet who has no record in their past is probably delusional. But where we get this idea is, where is the focus and trajectory of this prophet? If there's past sins, mistakes, and all that stuff, that's not going to nullify or invalidate a prophet because everybody is in the same boat there. But where is the prophet living today? Because if a prophet is actively sinning, then that just proved that they're not from God, that they're not one of those good fruit that Jesus was talking about, or good trees. Moving forward, there's a fifth way. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, this is leading up to talking about the gift of prophecy, we read earlier. And this is Paul talking about how we are to act. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Don't give offense to Jews or Gentiles of the church of God. People were challenging Paul on hanging out with Gentiles and kind of maybe being a little bit too Gentile-ish when he was really supposed to be modeling Jesus. He says, hey, whatever you eat or drink, whatever you do it all for the glory of God. I'm not doing it for your glory. But on the flip side of this, don't give offense to Jews or Gentiles of the church of God. This is another way of saying that, hey, don't purposely offend people. Don't live your life so far out on the edge that you're offending people. Continues, I too try to please everyone in everything I do. I don't just do what is best for me. I do what is best for others so that many may be saved. When Paul went into an area, he knew exactly what things were unconditional, or what things were unchanging in his act, in what he did. But he knew what things were flexible. And so he would be flexible where he could be flexible and unchanging in the things that mattered. But to the people off looking from the sidelines, hearing rumors about what was happening, it looked like he might have gone off the deep end. He didn't really care as much about those people. He wanted to do what was necessary at that time so that as many people as possible might be saved. Which leads us to the fifth idea. God's prophets give God the credit. Everything Paul did, he did for the glory of God. The prophet isn't going to be speaking for his own glory. He's going to be wanting to say, hey, God gave me this message. I wouldn't be speaking it otherwise. It also tells us a self-absorbed prophet contradicts God's selfless character. God gave everything for us. And a prophet who just kind of gives you that feeling that they're in it for themselves is not really a true prophet. Number 6. 1 Corinthians, now jumping a few chapters past the list of spiritual gifts we talked about, Paul kind of zeroes in and talks a little bit more about the gift of prophecy, and he says, but the one who prophesies, this is chapter 14, starting in verse 3, but the one who prophesies strengthens others, encourages them, and comforts them. This is what a New Testament post-Jesus prophet does. Prophesy strengthens others, encourages them, and comforts them. A person who speaks in tongues is strengthened personally, but one who speaks a word of prophecy strengthens the entire church. Interesting. Which leads, God's prophets love God's church. It should be kind of obvious to think about. When you see that written up there, that makes perfect sense, but if somebody isn't interested in building up the God's church, otherwise known as the bride of Christ, they are probably not from God. Even if everything else seems to check out, but they don't really like God's church, then I don't really trust them. God will not support a prophet, quote-unquote prophet, who wants to break up his church. As I was doing a little bit of research, it was interesting to see some of the people talking about the gift of prophecy saying that, well, no, the early church didn't get it right, but we're here now. And that just doesn't rub right with me. That doesn't make any sense. Because you're going to discount this to support what you're doing over here. That seems to contradict several of these keys. But if you forget all of this other stuff, there's one more key characteristic of a true prophet. And this one seems like it kind of takes all of the rest of them and overshadows all of them. This might be the best litmus test of them all, especially where we're living today. In 1 John chapter 4, starting in verse 1. John, talking to the early church, says, "Dear friends, do not believe everyone who claims to speak by the Spirit. You must test them to see if the Spirit they have comes from God. For there are many false prophets in the world." John is talking in the first century. How much more can we say that this would be true, that there's many false prophets in the world today, 2,000 years later? I got a list of false prophet years to kind of back that up. You must test them to see if the Spirit they have comes from God, for there are many false prophets in the world. This is how we know if they have the Spirit of God. This is the key. If a person claiming to be a prophet acknowledges that Jesus Christ came in a real body, that person has the Spirit of God. But if someone claims to be a prophet and does not acknowledge the truth about Jesus, that person is not from God. That's black and white. Did Jesus come as a person? Did he die for our sins? Was he raised from the dead? Did he return to heaven? That is the truth about Jesus. Does a prophet believe that? Does someone claiming to be a prophet believe that? Or do they reject that distinction? Such a person who rejects this has the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming into the world and is indeed already here. Did you realize that John actually sensed and understood that the Antichrist was already present and working in the thoughts and culture of that day? Interesting. But you belong to God, my dear children. You have already won a victory over those people because the Spirit who lives in you is greater than the Spirit who lives in the world. Those people belong to this world, so they speak from the world's viewpoint, and the world listens to them. But we belong to God, and those who know God listen to us. If they do not belong to God, they do not listen to us. Hey, if you're going to ignore what I'm saying, if you're going to ignore what the Bible's saying, of course you're not from God. The gist of what he's saying. This is how we know if someone has the spirit of truth or the spirit of deception. Which leads us to the seventh and maybe one of the biggest points. God's prophets teach a physical Jesus. Jesus came in a body, physically died, was buried, physically resurrected. People saw him. There is enough evidence to prove this. And then Jesus returned to heaven. Jesus came, lived, died, was resurrected, and returned to God. Satan hates this fact. Satan hates this fact. And so that's kind of a really easy litmus test to determine if someone is being supported by God or being supported by something else. And then we also have this. A false prophet will tell you what you want to hear, but a true prophet tells you what you need to hear. If we look at the prophets in the Old Testament, they told people exactly what they needed to hear, and chances are the people didn't really want to hear what they needed to hear. The false prophets spoke a message that the people wanted to hear, and they loved the false prophets. And so, when we look for prophets, for prophecy present today, it would be an error for us to just kind of latch on to something that we want to hear. Because chances are that is going to lead us astray. But if it's something that is hard to listen to, that challenges us, that we recoil at first, and then we kind of go back and we think about it and we're like, that probably is kind of what I needed to hear, but even I didn't really want to hear it. I wasn't really kind of nice to that person for saying that. That might have been a true prophet. But should we look for new prophets? Should we look for new prophets, or is what the Bible has given us enough? I want to say the Bible has given us everything we need for salvation. But just look at the world around you. Our world is so different than what the Bible world was like. Even the Old Testament, the New Testament, everything is different now. There's still the same emotions, the same themes, but the culture in many ways and the society in many ways is different. And what would Paul say? What would Moses say? Should we look for more prophets? Yes. Here's Paul. But let love be your highest goal. This is kind of coming off of that famous love chapter. Let love be your highest goal, but you should also desire the special abilities the Spirit gives, especially the ability to prophesy. Especially the ability to prophesy. This leads right into the other thing that we had just read, that prophecy is to be much more desired. It's going to strengthen and build up the church, and tongues is good for individual people, but it doesn't really help the group. Prophecy helps the church at large. Paul would love to see lots of prophets. And then there's Moses. And it's interesting that I found a little story in the book of Numbers that really hints at something, and Moses says something really profound about this. Numbers chapter 11, we're going to start in verse 16. And Moses had been taking on way too much stuff personally. It kind of just navigated towards him. And God said, hey, I'm going to help separate and just help diversify what you're doing to more people. Then the Lord said to Moses, gather before me 70 men who are recognized as elders and leaders of Israel. Bring them to the tabernacle to stand there with you. I will come down and talk to you there. I will take some of the Spirit that is upon you, and I will put the Spirit upon them also. I'm going to separate my Spirit out so that won't be just focused on you, it'll be also on these elders. They will bear the burden of the people along with you so that you will not have to carry it alone. Jumping down, let's see what happens. Back in verse 24, they're jumping down to verse 24. So Moses went out and reported the Lord's words to the people. He gathered the 70 elders and stationed them around the temple or tabernacle. And the Lord came down in the cloud and spoke to Moses. Then he gave the 70 elders the same Spirit that was upon Moses. He spread it out. He gave that Spirit to these elders. And when the Spirit rested upon them, they prophesied. But this never happened again. They prophesied, but it never happened again. But here is where this story takes an interesting twist. 2 men, Eldad and Medad, had stayed behind in the camp. They were listed among these 70 elders, but they had not gone out to the temple. There was only 68 people that went out to the temple, not all 70. But what happened? Yet the Spirit rested upon them as well, so they prophesied there in the camp. Interesting. A young man ran and reported to Moses, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. You guys are great. You are with God up here at the tabernacle, but these guys are prophesying back at the camp. What are we to do? Joshua, son of Nun, who had been Moses' assistant since his youth, protested, Moses, my master, make them stop prophesying. Make them stop. God is here, not over there. What does Moses say? But Moses replied, are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets and that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them all. Let that idea rest in your mind for a moment. Moses would love to have seen every single person in the camp of Israel to be a prophet. That is incredible. Then Moses returned to camp with the elders of Israel. Moses wanted to see tons and tons of prophets. He wanted to have that be the most common gift ever. Paul wanted us to look for and desire the gift of prophecy. And as we're thinking about this, when we look forward to Jesus returning, and we look at what Amos said, hey, God's not going to do anything without revealing what he's going to do with his prophets. Expect to see more prophets. Perhaps even look for them. Keep your eyes open for them. But keep in mind what makes a true prophet and what makes a false one. Because while there are many people out there focusing in on the end is near, focus on me, be very scared. We don't have to be worried about the end. We don't have to be worried about the end being near. We should actually welcome it because that means Jesus is returning. And that means that we get to go home to be with God in heaven. So look for prophets, look for prophecy, because that means God is getting ready to do something amazing in the world. Don't be scared of it. Don't be scared of it. But look for it. And test the spirits. Know that it's from God and then pay attention.